Authors Over 50, Writing in Life's Sweetest Third. Authors Over 50's weekly podcast celebrates writers and their journeys to publication. Writing after 50 is a whole story on its own, so let's skip to life's sweetest third and talk with authors about their journey from pen to publish. Welcome. I'm Julia Daly, your host, and I invite you to listen to interviews with writers who've achieved their goal of publishing a book just later in life. We've seen award lists for under 30 or under 40, but I've yet to see lists for those who've achieved a significant milestone of their own, launching a new career and publishing their first book after the age of 50. We will hear about these authors' inspirations, struggles, strategies, and the smell of that first book. These writers' journeys inspire me because I'm one of them. My guest today spent 15 years in an indie rock band, traveling the highways of America in a series of Ford vans. When he wasn't searching for fame and a safe place to eat before a gig, he started writing short stories and novels. His band, Uncle Green, went into semi-retirement after 4 labels, 7 records, and 1 name change, and my guest went to Georgia State University and majored in history and English, eventually earning an MA in history. His first novel, The Weight of Sound, was published in 2017 and won the Georgia Author of the Year Award for Best Debut. Songs by Honeybird was released in 2022. Both books have accompanying soundtracks of original songs. Welcome to Authors Over 50, Peter McDade.
Well, thanks for having me.
Peter, our opening question on Authors Over 50 is always, what took you so long to write your first book?
Yes, I listened to a few episodes and so I'm prepared for the first question. I was ready for it. I think in my case, it's not that it took me so long to write the first book. It's that it took me so long to figure out how to publish the first book. And also to write a book that I felt was worthy of publishing, right? As you know, it's one thing to write it. It's another thing to feel like I've actually got it to a place where it can be, maybe ready for the world. And in my case, it was, like you said, I was a musician. So in my 20s and 30s, that was my primary focus. And quite frankly, it was hard enough dealing with all the rejection you get in the music world. Like I wasn't ready to also take on the publishing world. But when the band semi-retired, I had more time, more bandwidth, especially after I finished my degree. And once I finished The Weight of Sound, once I thought I had finished it, for the first time, I thought it was worth trying to find a home for it.
Well, when you finished writing it, how did you proceed? Did you search for an agent or decide to use a hybrid or small press, or did you self-publish?
I searched for an agent for about 17 seconds. But again, the publishing world is so like the music world. There was a bit of PTSD there from the constant rejection. I mean, we started way back when you would take a cassette tape and stick it in an envelope and mail it off and wait. And even emailing, cold form, query letters, it was just very hard. And it was all taking so long, right? To even find an agent would take months. And then you would go in their queue before they would shop you. And then maybe you'd get a deal, and then it'd be another year and a half before that came out. My goal had been to publish by the time I was 50, and it was 51 when the first one came out. And it was through a small press, an indie press out of Virginia. And they also release records. So I'd come into contact with them in my music days. The publisher, Mark Doyen, had agreed to read the manuscript. And he loved it and said I would have a home there. And they were not confused by the idea of having a musical soundtrack. a few people would even agree to read it. I thought it was a good hook, right? It's like 2 for 1. You get a soundtrack and a book, but I think for some publishing houses, it was so unusual that it was confusing. Like it's one more thing they imagine they would have to struggle to deal with. Whereas Mark and Wampus Multimedia, who put out the book, were like, it's a great idea, so let's do it.
I think it's a great idea too. And you are my first rock star turned novelist that I'm interviewing. Do you think writing songs is a good background for writing a novel?
First of all, I'm flattered by the descriptor star. I'm not quite sure. I think in some very, very small corner of the musical world, there are a few people who would nod and say, Uncle Green, I think I remember that name.
You're in Wikipedia. You're
There
a star.
we go. I didn't write songs in the band, but what really helped me in terms of my fiction writing was watching and taking part in the assembly of songs, if that makes sense. How a song moves from a demo, which is very much like even pre-rough draft, like just scribblings that are maybe out of sequence. Then you refine that demo, and then you put parts to the song. There's your rough draft. And then you begin to practice it and refine it, and that's your revision. And so a song was sort of my brain like a short story or a chapter. And then the album is sort of like the book. And so we'd usually had more songs than we needed for the record. And so again, that's the revision of the final draft, right? You have some of those scenes or chapters that you just love that don't quite fit, and you just have to say goodbye to them. And then you put the whole thing together and put it away for a while. And then, you blare it really loud in your car and see if it holds up. And so the process is what really helped me, was understanding that not everything is perfect the first time, understanding that as important as a creative outburst is, the hard work of like actually putting it all together is what separates people who say, I have this great idea from a book, to someone who can say 3 years later, I wrote this book.
I think that's a great analogy to compare these two art forms. And I know that you have a lyrical tone to your stories because you are a musician and you were or are a drummer. So I'm doing a drum roll for your latest book and one of my books. They're both listed on the Chanticleer Book Review short list for an award. So congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's really exciting that it's out there in the world, and anything after that at this point is kind of bonus. Maybe that's an advantage of being over 50 when you first publish. It's like we understand, right, that it's not life or death. Well, one person who doesn't get it on Goodreads does not mean that my career is over. Whereas we were 22, and if we rolled into a town and we had a bad show, there would be like soul searching in the van afterwards. Like, oh my God, we're done for. And then eventually you realize, oh, we're going to play 200 shows this year. So they are not all going to be good.
How did writing that first book change your process of writing for the second?
The structure ideas that I learned from the first book helped a lot. And as much as I thought I'd already figured out that even when you think something is done, it's not done, I learned that all over again on a deeper level. The first book is 12 chapters, and the point of view rotates from chapter to chapter, from character to character. And some reappear and some don't. And I had 10 chapters, and I thought, oh, the book is done. But it wasn't until I reread the whole thing, and I got had a few beta readers read it, that I realized that actually I was missing not only the first chapter, but I was missing the last chapter. And so what I learned was, just like I said, just when you think it's done, you have to be open to this idea that it's not. And even though at that point I'd spent years because I started as short stories and then I assembled the novel, the idea of like, I've got to write more, like it was kind of exhausting. But also, as soon as I began, I realized it was the right move. And I really think having those first and last chapters completed it, in a way I hadn't imagined I'd be able to. And so for the second book, it was very similar. It was not being afraid to push yourself even a little bit more, if that makes sense. Even after all these years. I mean, we've all been writing since we were kindergarten or first grade, right? And so after all these years, to still figure out like, except maybe that's the word, except that I don't know everything. And I'm going to learn something as I go along.
Well, I think that writing fiction is a whole different animal. I was in public relations and marketing and wrote for years and years, but when I switched to fiction, I had to really learn the craft.
Yeah. It's a different skill set, though. It does, in a way, it pulls in all the others. Public relations. I mean, there's a directness to most public relations language, and I would imagine that that's a very helpful skill, right? Especially at a key moment in a scene or a book where you just need something to come across clearly. To be able to find that language is tricky. I teach college now, and I teach history, but I have them write a lot. And getting people to understand the value of what I call clear and direct language is hard. Everyone thinks that sometimes more is more, but no, really less really is more sometimes. So I would imagine the same way your previous experience, again, another advantage of being over 50, that life experience and those skill sets, everything can come into play in fiction. You're going to need it at some point.
What was your inspiration for that first book?
It was the idea of telling the story of a band, which had meant so much to me. The idea of trying people who either are music fans or just casual listeners to understand kind of the unique creation that a band can be. Like a tightly well-functioning band is like a family. And with all the pros and cons that come with being a part of a family. And I also had this idea that I wanted to show how the music the band makes, right? They make it in their own universe. They make it for themselves. But then, and this is where the other characters came into play, the music has this kind of ripple effect in the world. So we see chapters from points of view of the fan or from the girlfriend or the people who work for the band, and how the idea that you've something that's been created can have this tangible impact on everybody's life. Now, I say all that now because it's been years. At the time, I was just writing stories. I have no idea what my themes or meanings are until well into the revision process. I just follow the characters and I kind of hope that they will lead me somewhere.
And then what about the inspiration for the second book?
So the second book, Songs by Honeybird, actually started as a sketch of a short story 25 years ago. And it was a nameless couple, and they were breaking up because the woman was telling the man that her dog talked to her, not metaphorically, but literally talked to her. And the man couldn't handle it. And I played it all for laughs. But a few years after that, then I thought, well, that's kind of interesting in a way, because what is the breaking point within a relationship? Assuming you had a close relationship, what is something your partner or your girlfriend or boyfriend could come to you and tell you that would make you think, okay, I'm out. Check, please. This is too far. And while I originally thought, well, of course he was in the right, then it began to spin it, and I began to think, well, why would you just give up right away? Like, maybe shouldn't be played just for laughs. And I wrote an entire novel, 400 really dull pages, Um, and I put it aside because it didn't work. And then I wrote my first book. And after the first book, I just kept coming back to that scene. So this gets back to what inspired the whole thing was that breakup scene. And again, how it would ripple either way. So I rewrote the whole thing. I'd never read those 400 pages. I gave everybody new names. And I just started all over again, still trying to circle around what the actual book was. And another 2 or 3 years, and there it was.
Did real people inspire any of these characters?
I always say that my friends and the people I've met inspire everyone and no one. So, right? I mean, they're bits and pieces. We're kind of stealing from everybody that we go along. Even when you're not aware of it, I'm sure you're working on a book now, and part of your brain will meet somebody today, and a little piece of their story will kind of stick back there, like, oh, I'm going to keep that for later because I don't know, maybe I need it. I've never known anyone who said that their dog really talked to them, but I have known people who revealed parts of themselves that are almost too much. So yes and no.
Well, you say that you are still writing, you're teaching history, but do you have another book in you?
Oh yeah, I'm currently at the beta reader stage of the third book, which is right now it's called King Cal.
Well, do you have a writing routine? Do you write every day?
The routine, I have a routine, but it varies depending where I am in the process. So for me, the first draft is the hardest. I will confess that every part of this process is fun for me. I know I have lots of writer friends and I read interviews, and there are writers for whom this is very hard and torturous, but for me, it's always a blast. Just kind of why I do it. But the first draft is the hardest. And there I will usually go through bursts of trying to get going. And once I feel like I'm actually started a project, I need to write 1,000 words a day, and they could be terrible, but that stage, that's what needs to happen. I have a accountability partner, and we check in with each other depending where we are. Once I have a draft, then it's more fun. Then it's like I've dug up all the clay, right? So now I get to play with it. And so that's more fun. And then I'm trying to write every day. And I have 2 teenage daughters, and I teach history and I teach drums. So it could be that some days I have 10 minutes. It could be like today, I had an hour before this. And so I sat down and worked on a scene that I'm trying to add. I call it a patch. Like some beta readers have read this book, and I'm already seeing the gaps. And so right now I'm just writing a few scenes. I'm going to go back and try to graft in all the right spots. And then at the end, when you're doing line edits and just trying to get it ready for press, then it's every day, and it's for, a couple of hours a day, just rereading, making sure you're not missing anything, looking for all my ticks. My semicolons and my M dashes are my ticks, and like they each have to go on trial. Are you worthy, right? Are you going to be the one I allow to be on this page? And then it's all done, and it's weird because then it goes from being this thing you obsess about to this thing that's kind of off in the world.
Well, you're certainly a busy man, and most of our writers do want to write. They don't want to market themselves, and publicity becomes the bane of their existence. Have you found any publicity that works for you, or maybe that didn't work?
Yeah, I mean, it's we all want to write just to write, but we also want to sell books because that means people are reading them, right? And so that's why we wrote them. For the second novel, I hired a publicity company called Mindbuck Media, and I really was happy with them. I've learned again from the music world that musicians are the same way, right? Our music is our craft. At the same time, if you don't sell enough copies of your record, then you don't get to make your music. And even when we were on big labels, we would still hire our own our own promotions people for the radio, because the promotions people on staff at Sony and Atlantic have so much other stuff to do, right? Basically, what works is finding somebody who really gets the project, understands the project, and wants to help promote the project because they understand it. And so I will look for a publicist for the next one as well. And I'll do the same thing where I just talk to them and try to get a feel for whether or not they're on the same wavelength. And you can do everything right and still not sell any books. And that's just, you have to go into the whole process understanding that, right? If you set this goal in your mind that you're going to sell 5,000 copies or 10,000 copies of your novel, statistically, you're probably not. So it's best to know that going in, right, to enjoy all the other parts.
Yes, only about 2% sell those numbers of books. And
Yep.
from what I hear, 2 million books are released in the US alone every year. So that's an incredible number.
Yes. And that's again why you have to appreciate the entire process. So the writing, that initial push when it comes out. For both books, I had a nice launch party where I had a band play so we could play songs from the soundtrack. And then that's probably going to be the peak, I understand, of actual attention. And after that, if I get to go to conferences or talk to people on podcasts, any moment where I'm getting to be author Pete, a guy talking about a book that he has published, 9-year-old Pete is very happy because that was the dream. So here it is, on whatever scale it happens, it has managed to happen.
Well, and we're told that those first 6 months are so vital, but people are discovering books years after they've been published. So we still have time, even though they say that it's more difficult the farther out we get from our published date. But I'm discovering and reading lots of books that are several years old.
Exactly. And it's, especially for your indie book writers, it's word of mouth. And so 2 years from now, someone's going to force Weight of Sound or songs by Honeybird into somebody else's hand, and they'll read it. And I hope they like it, We'll never know, odds are, but we just have to trust that the book is now out there in the world and that it will be found by somebody.
Well, and like your songs and band being out there as a legacy to your family, your daughters are going to say, my father is an author, and I wonder how your family feels about you switching gears from music to writing novels.
Right now, the teenage girls are not exactly impressed with anything their parents do. From making dinner to publishing books, it's all, I think in their minds, it's a miracle we can get up and walk straight because we know so little. But someday, yes. And maybe somewhere in there. And I like to think that a lot of parenting is modeling behavior, right? There's only so much we can tell them to do because they've just shut down. But I like to think they're watching that I'm spending time on creative stuff. Whether or not it amounts to huge commercial success, it's the process. Again, the process that seemed to keep me a relatively even-keeled and mostly together human being, right? And so they're watching that and taking that in.
Well, Pete, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the passages you've brought to share today and then read from your book so that we can hear your tone and voice?
Well, I brought an early scene from Songs by Honeybird. And Songs by Honeybird follows this couple after they break up. So it's Ben and Nina, and the book alternates between their points of view. And so the odd chapters are Nina and the even chapters are Ben. And this is early, and Nina has just come back from a walk with one of her friends from her 2 weeks of kind of post breakup, not quite depression, but that period, lethargy, we'll say, where the apartment's a mess and she hasn't done anything and she's barely leaving the house, but she still has to walk her dog. So her dog's name is Sid. Her now ex-boyfriend's name is Ben. And this is Nina's point of view. And she's coming back into the apartment building, and she has to tell the apartment building manager that the bigger apartment she was going to need so she and Ben could live together, she doesn't need, because Ben is not actually going to move in. When Nina gets back to the lobby, Morris, the building manager, is ensconced at the large wooden desk he uses as an office. He is surrounded, as usual, by several much younger and buffer men, masses of muscle packed into tight shorts and holding phones. They all seem to adore the 60-ish, 70-ish Morris, with his dyed hair and omnipresent silk scarf. She's never been able to figure out if he's dating one or all or none of them. "Hey," she says, catching his eye. "Well, hey, he answers, with his thick drawl and customarily confident smile. Missing several front teeth has not dimmed the man's bravado. "How are you, darling?" "Fine, thanks." She takes a deep breath. Morris had let her have the first look at a bigger apartment that had opened up, but if Ben isn't moving in, she can't afford it. "Turns out I'm not going to take D14 after all. Can I just renew B6? Morris immediately assumes a look of compassion. "Well, of course, he says. Things didn't work out with your young man." She shakes her head, determined not to cry, though she suspects there are worse places to break down in tears than in front of half a dozen gay men. Nope, turns out he's not the live-together kind. Morris reaches across his desk to pat her arm, and one of the muscle shirts next to her says sympathetically, "Few of them are, baby. Few of them are." Nina forces a smile and makes an appointment to sign the lease later that afternoon. When they walk to the door, Sid heads to his favorite morning sunspot in front of the glass doors. He stretches and gives what Nina thinks of as hold my calls look before he sits down. So she knows he'll probably not move again until lunchtime. She drops his leash on the small dining table, on top of a pair of dirty jeans and an empty shake cup from Five Guys. The short burst of energy from her walk is fading quickly, so she carries her phone over to the futon, still open as a bed, and scans her messages. So what now? What now? Nina drops the phone next to her, lies down, and closes her eyes. Sleep? Maybe I should just go back to sleep. That's my plan, Sid says, without turning his attention away from the glass doors. But I expected more from you. Well, that's why expectations are dangerous. Nina lifts her head up slightly and opens her eyes to look at this dog she had never planned on having. Sid scratches the back of his head with his right paw and then stands up to pace in a small circle. Maybe that should be my new motto. No expectations, Nina says, as she watches Sid find the perfect spot and then collapse, forming a small black ball of fur. She closes her eyes. Much better. As tired as she feels, she knows she should force herself to log in to the GSU website and sign up for new classes. If she starts spending too much time in the studio apartment, just Nina Alexander and her amazing talking dog, she might be living in Crazy Town by the start of summer, if she's not already there.
That's great, Peter.
Thank you.
You've drawn us in and made us want to read more.
Read more. What happens next?
That's right, exactly. What would you say is your writing kryptonite?
My writing kryptonite. So the thing that keeps me from writing. I would say my writing kryptonite is probably probably that wall that appears in front of you and you're not sure how to get around it. Does that make sense? That moment in a project where you're really just like, I am boxed in. And I find the house benefits because the laundry is done and the kitchen is cleaned. Even the toilets get a scrubbing, right? Because I have to get away from it at a moment, And that Kryptonite, there is a workaround. There's always a workaround, but that's the moment usually where I wind up finding I haven't touched it in 4 or 5 days because that wall just needs to I need to find the path around it somehow, and usually that involves doing something other than writing.
Well, I think a lot of people think of that as writer's block, but if you're writing with alternating chapters and different points of view, sometimes you can skip ahead to different points of view and then come back to that. I've found, but sometimes that one scene gets in your head so much that it does prevent you from going forward.
Yep. I mean, I write out of sequence, and that's the only way I can get anything done. But there is sometimes it's like that missing piece, and until you crack that scene, you can't move forward. Like you feel like you're wasting your time on other stuff because you just haven't figured out how to get around that. It's usually not early on. Usually it's in a revision where, like the one I'm currently working on, again, there's a kind of a big discussion at the end, and I know what needs to be the result of that discussion, but I haven't fully set it up. Like there's some missing pieces there, and I'm finding myself doing a lot of laundry. It's almost like you're still writing, but you're not in front of it. Does that make sense? Superman had to fly away for a while. He's still flying, and I'm still working on it, but I'm not literally writing it at the moment.
Well, like your talking dog, our characters do get in our heads and they do talk to us, and sooner or later we'll work it out with them.
Exactly.
Well, Peter, as always, our last interview question is, our writers over 50 are a unique set. Do you have any advice for writers 50 and above?
It's the same way. It's the same advice I've given to a few people who come to me for drum lessons after they've turned 50, and they've come and they've said, is it too late to start? And of course the answer is never. It is never too late. That think of your age at this point as not a deterrent or a problem, right? But think of your age as something that is an advantage. Think of all the stuff you know now that you didn't know at 20 or 30 or even 40, right? And every time you sit down, right, all of that stuff is going to wind up helping you. So embrace the process. Maybe that's what it boils down to. Whatever part of the process you're in, enjoy it. Let's face it, some mediocre wipe us all out tomorrow. Don't let your last day be sitting there thinking you wish you had written something. Whatever part of the process you've got for that hour or two, try to enjoy it.
That's great advice. And I think using some of that wisdom and hindsight that we all have at this age, and that's why I call it writing in life's sweetest third, because we have all of that we can unpack, and it makes our work even richer. So we just appreciate your being with us today. You've led such an exciting life and still are. And we can reinvent ourselves many times and have lots and lots of exciting careers. So thank you so much. And we're excited to say that you're now one of our authors over 50.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thank you for joining us today. Please look for Authors Over 50 every Thursday, when we will have conversations with accomplished debut novelists over the age of 50. Please subscribe and share with a friend. And check out my own publication journey after 50 at www.juliadaily, that's DAILY, like dailynewspaper.com. Until next time, keep reading and writing. And remember, it's never too late to fulfill a dream in life's sweetest third.